In our previous video, we talked about the types of cells that are found in the nervous system, which include glial cells and also neurons. In this video, we're going to begin to talk about how neurons do their job, which is to communicate with other cells, including other neurons, but also other cells such as muscle cells, glands, things of that nature. The way that neurons communicate with other cells is through action potentials, and this is an electrical method of communicating. There are three parts to this communication. The first part is the generation of the action potential, and we've already talked about how the action potential is generated at the trigger zone, which is found between the soma and the axon. And here we can see a representation of an action potential. Here the neuron is at rest and the membrane potential is not changing. It's at that -70. But when the neuron becomes active, now you can see that the membrane potential changes. And so while we call this an action potential, it's really just that graphic representation of the change in membrane potential. Once the action potential has been generated at the trigger zone, we need to move it down the axon and get it to the synaptic knobs. And that process is what's known as conduction. And so conduction is just simply moving the action potential from the trigger zone down along the length of the axon. And then finally, what we have to do is move the signal from one cell to the next cell. This is referred to as transmission. Quite often, transmission is happening across a chemical synapse in which a neurotransmitter is released. And so that's where the term transmission comes from in neurotransmitter. It's important that you use these three terms precisely and in the right way. And so from now on, generation will refer to the creation of the action potential at the trigger zone. Conduction is the movement of the action potential down the axon, and transmission is moving it from one cell to the next. Before we get on with that, we're going to define some terms. Those of you who've had some physics may already be familiar with these. One term is voltage. Potential energy it can be generated by separating charges, and we can do that by separating ions. And so we do that across our cell membranes. We have cations and anions that are found in different concentrations on either the inside or the outside of the cell. And I hope that you remember that sodium, for instance, is found in very high concentration outside the cell, whereas the concentration inside the cell is very low. And for potassium, it's just the opposite. There's a very high concentration of potassium inside and a low concentration outside the cell. We talk about a potential difference, or just simply a potential, which can be measured in volts or across cell membranes. Because those charges are so small, we measure them in millivolts. A millivolt is just a thousandth of a volt. And so this is the voltage that's measured between 2 points. For example, the inside of the cell and also the outside of the cell. And here you can see the way that we do that. And so we have a cell, this is typically an axon, and we have what's called a microelectrode, very, very fine point that allows us to insert that between the phospholipids into the interior of the cell. And so now you can see that we have that membrane potential measured. Current is actually the flow of electric charge from one point to another point. And in your body, that flow of current is typically due to the movement of ions across the membrane. And those ions can move because we have protein channels that are embedded between the phospholipids. And you remember we've talked about sodium leak channels, which allow sodium to move across, and potassium leak channels. But then we also have other channels that allow for movement of ions. It's also important that you understand what we mean when we say that the membrane is polarized. We're just simply saying that, much like a battery, it has a negative pole and a positive pole. And so it is indeed polarized. Cell membranes have a potential or a potential difference across them, and as we saw in the previous diagram, we're able to measure that potential difference. And here you can see that that potential difference is about -70 millivolts, and that's what it typically is for a neuron when that neuron is quiet and not doing anything. And for that reason, we refer to this as the resting membrane potential, or simply the RMP. Some cells, like neurons and muscles, actually have the ability to alter this membrane potential and make it something different than -70. And so we say that those cells are excitable. To understand membrane potentials, it's really important that you understand, number one, ion concentration gradients. And again, we've talked about those. You know that there's a concentration gradient when something is in higher concentration on one side of the membrane than it is on the other side of the membrane. It's also important that you know that things want to move down both their electro and chemical gradients. And we lump that together and talk about electrochemical gradient. Things always go from high concentration to low concentration unless they're being moved actively. They also will go down electrical gradient, unlike charges attract. And so the positive sodium on the outside of the cell is attracted by the negative charge on the inside of the cell. And then you also need to understand that we can change the permeability of membranes, and you need to know how we do that. Permeability just means that we make them more or less permeable to a particular ion. We do that through protein channels that are embedded in the phospholipid bilayer. And here you can see a really important protein channel. This is referred to as a voltage-gated sodium channel. And that's because a change in voltage across the membrane can open it up. The voltage-gated sodium channel is important. It has both an activation gate, which you can see here is closed when the neuron is quiet or at rest. It also has an inactivation gate, which when the neuron is at rest is open. Here you can see that when we change the voltage across the membrane, the activation gate opens, the inactivation gate closes, but it closes very slowly. And so for the time that the activation gate is open and the inactivation gate hasn't yet closed, lots of sodium can move across and come down its electrochemical gradient to get to the inside of the cell. Eventually that inactivation gate does close. Here's a different depiction, a schematic representation of the voltage-gated sodium channel. Activation gate, inactivation gate, and this is the resting state. And then the activation gate will open in response to a change in voltage across the membrane. Inactivation gate will close, but it does it slowly, and that allows sodium to come across. Another type of gate that we have is a voltage-gated calcium channel. And so again, a change in voltage across the membrane will open up the calcium channel and allow calcium to enter the cell. Here you can see the alpha helix that makes up parts of that protein. So you see several different helices, and they're crumpled up to show the tertiary and even the quaternary form of that protein channel. Here you can see the schematic representation. In the top picture, it's closed, and in the bottom one, it's open and calcium can go through. Here, we're just looking down onto the top of the channel when it's closed and the calcium can't get moved through there. We also have voltage-gated potassium channels, and I don't have a picture of that for you, but they're much like the voltage-gated calcium channel. Now, we can open protein channels not just by changing the voltage, but also by using a chemical signal referred to as a ligand. And so now these are ligand-gated ion channels. Here you can see the ligand is a chemical known as ACH, or acetylcholine. This is the very first neurotransmitter ever identified. When acetylcholine binds in two places to this channel, it opens it up. And now potassium can leave, but sodium can also come in. And so this is a non-specific ion channel, and that's why it's called the ligand-gated ion channel and not a sodium or calcium or potassium channel. And again, here you can see the actual alpha helices that make up the protein structure of this channel. Here it's closed, here it's open, where you can see that ligand has bound to the receptor site in the protein, and now the ion can move across the membrane because we've increased the permeability of the membrane to that particular ion. Now, we talk about action potential generation. There are certain terms that you have to be familiar with. Again, the membrane is polarized. And because it's polarized, we actually can depolarize it. That's what happens when we change the permeability. We depolarize it, and it goes from -70 to something less negative than that. Here you can see the membrane potential at about -70, and it's gone down to about -20. And so we've depolarized this membrane. If we can depolarize a membrane, we can also repolarize a membrane. That simply means we're going to go ahead and return it to -70 again. And not only can we depolarize and repolarize membranes, but we can also hyperpolarize a membrane. That just simply means that we're going to make it actually more negative than negative 70. Here we've gone to negative 80, negative 100, and even more, even though that's actually not possible. We really only can get to negative 90, which means that potassium is at equilibrium. And here you can see our measurement of the resting membrane potential. We're at negative 70 millivolts, and so that neuron is at rest. And here you can see that, again, a second time. You can see the microelectrode being pushed down in between the phospholipids that make up the phospholipid bilayer. All right, let's go ahead and look at our actual action potential. Again, we never really truly see an action potential. What we see is the graphic representation of the change in membrane potential as that neuron goes from rest to active. And you can see that what we're doing is we're depolarizing this thing, and sodium is coming into the cell and making it less negative. We're depolarizing it from negative 70 to negative 65 to negative 60 to negative 55 to negative 50. At that point, we reach what's referred to as threshold. Sometimes threshold is negative 50, sometimes it's negative 55. And at this point, you can see that the permeability to sodium becomes much, much greater, and sodium floods into the cell. And now the depolarization happens very, very rapidly, and this phase is almost vertical, straight up and down. This is occurring because now we've opened up those voltage-gated sodium channels. And again, we open up the activation gate, and sodium rushes through. Now, what happens when sodium comes through a couple of these channels is that we depolarize the membrane, which opens up more of the voltage-gated sodium channels. That allows more sodium to come in, which opens up more of these. And so you see what we've done is we've gotten into a positive feedback loop at the point where we hit threshold. And essentially what we do is we open up 100% of these guys by getting into this positive feedback loop. And that's why the depolarization there is so rapid. Well, at some point, you can see that we stop depolarizing it. We hit approximately plus 30 and we stop. And that is because the inactivation gate has now shut. No more sodium can get into the inside of the cell. Well, now we need to repolarize it. We're repolarizing it by opening up voltage-gated potassium channels. And so now potassium will go down its electrochemical gradient. And what it will do is it will leave the cell, making it less positive until it actually drops below zero and becomes negative. And it will go all the way to negative 80, becoming hyperpolarized. It'll stay hyperpolarized, but now at this point, those voltage-gated potassium channels will shut. So the question is, how does it get from negative 80 back up to negative 70? All right, voltage-gated sodium channels are closed, voltage-gated potassium channels are closed, and those sodium-potassium pumps are working constantly, and what they do is they will pump the sodium out of the cell, they pump the potassium back into the cell, we get back to negative 70, our voltage-gated sodium channels are back to the resting state, voltage-gated potassium channels are back, and we're ready to go again. And so there we've seen an action potential. This diagram shows you both the action potential in blue. The blue line is the action potential. Depolarization phase, repolarization, and even hyperpolarization. It also shows you the change in permeability, number one, to sodium, and number two, to potassium. And so first, I'd like to point out that at rest, the permeability of the membrane to potassium is greater than it is to sodium, and that's because we've got a lot more potassium leak channels in the membrane than we do sodium leak channels. All right, and so we're at rest, and the voltage-gated potassium channels are closed, and the voltage-gated sodium channels are also closed. And so we're good, we're at rest. Well, now we get into the depolarization phase. And again, as we said, we start to open up these voltage-gated sodium channels so that sodium can come into the cell. And at some point we hit threshold, we get into the positive feedback loop and essentially open up all of these things. Eventually the inactivation gate will close. And the potassium channel will open up. And at this point, you can see inactivation gate is closed. where up here we can no longer depolarize the cell by having sodium come in. Voltage-gated potassium channel opens, and so potassium leaves, and we repolarize the cell. In fact, before it can shut, we actually get a little bit of a hyperpolarization, and so we get to approximately negative 80. And here you can see that when the voltage-gated sodium channels are opened up, then the permeability of the membrane to sodium has gone way up. When the inactivation gate shuts, permeability goes way back down. We've opened up the voltage-gated potassium channels, and the permeability to potassium is very high. Okay. When we talk about action potentials, we have what's referred to as the all or none law. The all or none law tells us we're either going to get an action potential or we aren't going to get an action potential. And here you can see a couple of examples where we've stimulated the cell and we've gotten what's known as an EPSP, or an excitatory postsynaptic potential. We've depolarized it a little bit, but we've only depolarized it to about negative 68 or so. And then we stopped. Well, we didn't reach threshold, and so we don't get an action potential. The sodium-potassium pumps can now easily keep up with the amount of sodium that's crossing into the cell. They pump it back out, and we get back to our negative 70 or resting membrane potential. Here you can see that we can actually add EPSPs, and so now we've gotten to approximately negative 66, but we still haven't reached threshold, and so as a result, sodium-potassium pumps pump everything back out again. Here in this particular example, you can see that we've added 3 EPSPs, which now finally get us past threshold. We now kick off that positive feedback loop. We open up all the sodium, voltage-gated sodium channels, and so we get a full-blown action potential. In this particular case, even though we've given it a stronger stimulus, opening up all the voltage-gated sodium channels only allows so much sodium in, and so you can see that the 2 action potentials are essentially identical, hence all or none law when we talk about that. And so a question then becomes, if all the action potentials are the same size, how is it that we know that one pain is worse than another pain, or one light is brighter than another? And again, I'm sure that a number of you have already said, well, the strength of the stimulus is coded in how many action potentials we get, or the frequency. And so here we can see an example of that. This action potential is occurring so fast that it just looks like a single line up and down. If we expanded the x-axis, we would actually be able to see the depolarization, repolarization. Here we're putting a light pressure on a receptor, and the action potential is fired just very, very, very slowly, only 1, 2, 3. We increase the pressure and we get more action potentials. And you can see that as we increase the pressure to a greater and greater amount, we get more and more action potentials. And so the strength of the stimulus is coded in action potential frequency. And that's how we do that. And here's a different look at that. And so here we can see that there's a subthreshold stimulus, no action potential. Here we get a stimulus which is greater than threshold, more action potentials, but they're all the same size. And here is an even stronger stimulus, and again, all the action potentials are the same size, but we get even more of them, and so the frequency is greater, indicating that that's a stronger stimulus that we're having there. All right. Another part of the action potential that we have to talk about is what's referred to as refractory periods. And there are really 2 refractory periods. One is the absolute refractory period. During this absolute refractory period, we cannot get a second action potential no matter what we do. And that's because we can't open up more of the sodium, the voltage-gated sodium channels than all of them. They're all open. We can't do anything more than that. And that accounts for that first half of this. Once the inactivation gate is shut, we can't get another action potential no matter what we do. We just have to wait until they open up. At some point, we get to the point where the voltage-gated sodium channels are starting to reset, and we could reopen the activation gate. And then we get into what's called the relative refractory period. The relative refractory period means you can get another action potential. We could get another action potential here, but it requires a stronger stimulus than before. Part of the reason for that is that when we're here in the hyperpolarized state, we're further away from threshold, and so rather than depolarizing by 10 millivolts, we need to depolarize by 20 millivolts to reach threshold and to get our action potential. And so that's what we mean by refractory periods. Absolute refractory period, we cannot get another action potential no matter what. Relative refractory period, we can, but it requires a greater than stronger stimulus. Notice that the relative refractory period does not end until we get back up to our resting membrane potential of negative 70 millivolts. And then finally, we've already actually talked about that. If we get an EPSP which does not reach threshold, we get no action potential. Not only that, the membrane potential returns to negative 70. And again, why is it that we said that the membrane potential returns to negative 70 if we don't reach threshold? And you might remember that the answer to that is because the sodium-potassium pumps, which are always working on always pumping sodium out of the cell and potassium in, can keep up with the depolarization and actually return us back to resting membrane potential. In our next slide, we'll talk about conduction of the action potential and transmission.